Kevin Costner didn't arrive in Hollywood with famous parents, powerful friends, or a studio waiting to turn him into a star. Like Bruce Willis, he had to crawl his way up from day jobs and roles so small they barely qualified as employment. Their early careers were actually surprisingly similar. Both worked as drivers. Both studied acting after finishing their regular shifts. The main difference was that Willis actually worked at a nuclear power plant, while Costner only lived near one. That may explain why Bruce lost all his hair, while Kevin merely spent the next 40 years negotiating with his hairline. After marrying Cindy Silva, which technically made him the husband of Cinderella, Costner decided he might have a future as an actor. He took classes, learned just enough about the business to become dangerously optimistic, and started auditioning anywhere that would let him through the door. Hollywood responded by ignoring him. For years, Costner bounced between tiny roles in movies nobody remembers. That was exactly what happened with The Big Chill. Costner originally had a real part, then the entire role was removed. What remained was his character's dead body. Years later, friends would basically recycle the same joke with Joey. But The Big Chill itself became a major success. Costner followed The Big Chill with a few more appearances in movies almost nobody saw. Then came Fandango, the feature-directing debut of Kevin Reynolds, a filmmaker who would later become one of Costner's closest friends and most frequent collaborators. The movie grew out of Reynolds' student film, which had caught the attention of Steven Spielberg. Spielberg liked the short enough to encourage Reynolds to turn it into a feature. There was just one awkward detail. Reynolds had already rejected Costner for the student version because he didn't see anything special in him. Costner went home disappointed, but when Spielberg's company put money behind the feature and Costner auditioned again, Reynolds apparently discovered the talent he had missed the first time and gave him the lead role. Then Spielberg saw the finished movie and apparently reconsidered every decision that had led him there. He hated it. Amblin backed away from a wide release and Fandango opened on only 27 screens. It earned roughly $90,000, which was less of a theatrical run than a very expensive private screening. Reynolds quickly moved toward television. Costner had slightly better luck, although he also showed up in Amazing Stories, the anthology series Spielberg produced and Reynolds worked on. The real break came from Lawrence Kasdan. Costner was making the small cycling drama American Flyers when Kasdan called him about a new Western. Kasdan later admitted that he still felt bad for the young actor who had worked so hard on The Big Chill, only to end up playing a corpse. So he decided to give Costner another chance, this time as someone who remained alive for most of the movie. That movie was Silverado. At the time, Westerns were considered dangerous territory. The genre had been badly wounded by the legendary failure of Heaven's Gate, and Hollywood was in no hurry to spend serious money on cowboys again. Silverado became one of the first major studio westerns to test whether audiences were ready to come back. According to Costner, it was also the movie that made him fall in love with the genre that would eventually define his entire career. Financially, Silverado was not a major hit. It cost around $26 million and earned roughly $32 million worldwide. But critics liked it. The film received 2 Academy Award nominations, and Costner became one of its most talked-about performers, despite having a supporting role. One of the first major offers came from Oliver Stone, who wanted Costner for Platoon. Exactly which role he was offered remains disputed. Some accounts claim it was the part that eventually went to Charlie Sheen after Emilio Estevez left the project. Others say Stone had a different character in mind. Either way, Costner turned him down. He later said he disagreed with the movie's tone. That would become a recurring feature of Kevin Costner's career. He didn't just reject roles. He often rejected the entire philosophy behind the movie. Instead, he chose the political thriller No Way Out. It was not the safest possible bet. Michelle Pfeiffer had passed on the female lead, which eventually went to Sean Young, and a long list of rising male stars had already rejected Costner's role. No Way Out wasn't a giant blockbuster, but it performed respectably, audiences liked it, critics responded well, and most importantly, it proved that Costner could carry a serious studio thriller. Then came the movie that changed everything. Brian De Palma's The Untouchables had spent years trapped in development. Actors kept turning down major roles, and at several points the entire project seemed close to falling apart. Marlon Brando rejected the role of Al Capone, despite being offered $5 million for less than 3 weeks of work. The role eventually went to Robert De Niro. Finding Elliot Ness was no easier. Michael Douglas, Harrison Ford, Mel Gibson, and Don Johnson were all considered. Johnson was reportedly interested but couldn't escape his commitment to Miami Vice. Eventually, the producers pushed for Costner after being impressed by his audition. A few months later, Kevin Costner was a movie star. The Untouchables became a major hit and pushed Costner into an entirely different level of fame. Sean Connery won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor and completed one of Hollywood's great career comebacks. Robert De Niro received plenty of attention as Capone. But for Costner, the film was the moment he stopped being the promising guy critics noticed in supporting roles and became a legitimate leading man. He began turning down movies almost as quickly as studios could offer them. The list is enormous. Not quite Sylvester Stallone enormous. Stallone may be the undefeated champion of rejecting movies that later became hits, but Costner made a serious run at the title. Curiously, he never turned down Die Hard, even though practically every male actor in Hollywood appears to have rejected that movie at some point. Kevin Costner was the exception, mostly because nobody actually offered it to him. Some reports claim his name was briefly discussed, but perhaps the producers knew what would happen. By then, Costner had developed a habit of explaining to filmmakers why their scripts were wrong, why their casting ideas were wrong, and how the entire project could be improved if everyone simply listened to Kevin Costner. Maybe the producers of Die Hard just weren't emotionally prepared to learn that much about themselves. He did, however, turn down big. The choice came down to Tom Hanks's fantasy comedy or the baseball film Bull Durham. Costner later admitted that the decision was difficult, but he chose the sports movie. The role had originally been closely connected to Kurt Russell. Russell had helped develop the screenplay, and early drafts sometimes used his own name as a placeholder for the main character. But when production was finally ready to begin, Russell couldn't make the schedule work and asked the filmmakers to delay shooting. They might have done it. Then Kevin Costner became interested. The role went to him instead. Russell apparently held no grudge. After seeing the finished movie, he wrote Costner a personal letter, congratulating him and admitting that he couldn't have played the part any better himself. By then, there was no question whose movie it was. Costner was the central star. His was the only face on the poster. Bull Durham cost just $7 million and earned $50 million at the box office. Then came Field of Dreams, which turned a $10 million budget into $84 million worldwide. 2 hits later, Costner was no longer asking Hollywood for permission. He was beginning to explain to Hollywood how things should be done. That should have been the first warning. The next project was Revenge, a dark thriller based on a novella by Jim Harrison. The movie had originally been developed for Jack Nicholson, with legendary director John Huston attached. Nicholson loved the script, but years of delays and scheduling problems eventually pushed him out. Costner wanted the role and personally approached Huston. Huston said no. According to the story, he thought Costner was too lightweight for the material and joked that the most convincing thing Kevin could play in the movie was a tree. Unfortunately for Huston, The Untouchables and Bull Durham had already made Costner very valuable. The producers sided with the actor. Huston insisted it was his movie, and the studio responded by showing him the door. Hollywood had officially reached the point where Kevin Costner had more power than John Huston. Once Huston was gone, Costner considered directing the film himself. Producer Ray Stark convinced him not to rush into a directing debut and suggested that he first spend a little more time watching experienced filmmakers work. Surprisingly, Costner listened. Tony Scott was brought in instead. The budget immediately began to grow. New World Pictures ran into serious financial trouble. Sony took over the project, and money started pouring into a film that had originally been designed as a relatively modest thriller. Costner also brought in Anthony Quinn, who was not exactly working for pocket change. According to one of the more colorful stories from the production, the cast and crew sometimes treated the set less like a workplace and more like an open bar. A young John Leguizamo reportedly got drunk enough to throw up on Tony Scott. Fortunately, Scott was apparently in no condition to file a formal complaint. The original $10 million budget climbed to $15 million. The movie then earned only $16 million in American theaters. Revenge was the first real warning that Kevin Costner's instincts were not automatically worth millions of dollars. It would remain his only major box office disappointment between 1986 and 1994. Right after Revenge, Costner was offered the role of Jack Ryan in The Hunt for Red October. The producers specifically wanted him, but he turned them down. This time, he had a very good reason. He wanted to direct Dances with Wolves. Costner had first read Michael Blake's screenplay in 1986. He liked the story, but believed Hollywood would take it more seriously if it existed as a novel first. So he encouraged Blake to rewrite it as a book. The novel was published in 1988, and Costner quickly bought the film rights. For his directing debut, he was not thinking small. The movie was a large-scale Western. Costner also invested some of his own money and brought in his old friend Kevin Reynolds to help him through production. The shoot was brutal. Costner nearly developed pneumonia, fell off horses repeatedly, and came close to seriously injuring himself more than once. He refused to use a double for scenes with the wolf, even though the animal was not exactly a model employee. It reportedly bit its trainer and charged members of the crew. To make himself less interesting, Costner scattered large chunks of meat around the set and hoped the wolf would choose the easier lunch. During the scene in which his character rides in front of enemy lines with his arms stretched out, Costner improvised the entire gesture. The stunt coordinator watching it happen probably aged several years before the cameras stopped rolling. The production also became surrounded by rumors that hundreds of bison had been slaughtered for the movie. Local residents complained. Police and animal welfare groups arrived. Filming was repeatedly interrupted. Then everyone discovered that the horrifyingly realistic dead bison were props. Almost everyone in the industry expected the movie to become a spectacular disaster. Executives and journalists began calling it Kevin's Gate, a reference to Heaven's Gate, one of the most notorious financial failures in Hollywood history. Then Costner delivered his first cut. It ran 5 hours. The studio asked him to cut it down to 2. Costner compromised by giving them 3, which tells you almost everything about Kevin Costner at the height of his power. The final theatrical version ran just under 3 hours. When Dances with Wolves expanded nationwide in November 1990, it opened in 3rd place with about $9 million. For a $22 million movie, that was respectable, but hardly the kind of debut that silences an entire industry. Then something unusual happened. The movie simply refused to leave theaters. What looked like a modest opening turned into one of the strongest long-term theatrical runs of the era. By the end, Dances with Wolves had earned $424 million worldwide against a $22 million budget. It remained the highest-grossing Western ever made, until Django Unchained passed it by roughly $1 million more than 2 decades later. That was less a defeat than a clerical correction. Adjusted for inflation, Dances with Wolves would have earned close to $1 billion today. The film won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. It became the first Western to win Best Picture since 1931. Hollywood had spent months laughing at Kevin's Gate. Audiences gave Kevin Costner 7 Oscars. Costner had financed part of the movie himself and negotiated a percentage of the profits. He reportedly made more than $40 million from the American theatrical release alone, and close to $70 million overall. The true number is probably higher once home video and later revenue are included. Costner became one of the biggest stars in the world, and for several years almost everything he touched turned into a hit. He usually did not demand the largest upfront salary. Instead, he negotiated a share of the profits, a strategy that made him very rich and kept studio accountants nervous for decades. Those deals also led to repeated legal disputes, with Costner later claiming that studios had underpaid him on back-end revenue. Most of the cases were reportedly settled before reaching trial. For Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, rumors suggested he earned an 8-figure payday. Critics, meanwhile, could not understand why audiences kept showing up. By this point, many reviewers had grown openly hostile to the entire Kevin Costner formula. They attacked The Bodyguard and treated the movie as proof that his winning streak had finally ended. Audiences responded by making it the 2nd highest grossing film of the year, behind only Disney's Aladdin. For a while, Costner could do no wrong. But like many major stars, he still wanted critical respect. He began choosing projects that looked less like guaranteed blockbusters and more like awards contenders. One of them was Clint Eastwood's A Perfect World. Eastwood originally intended to direct the movie without appearing in it. Costner convinced him to take one of the major roles. The result was the first Eastwood film since 2 Mules for Sister Sarah, in which Clint's name appeared second in the credits. Kevin Costner received top billing. Eastwood had originally considered Denzel Washington for the lead, but once Costner became interested, turning down one of the biggest stars in the world was no longer an easy option. On paper, the movie had everything: a respected director, an ambitious script, and two powerful actors who had both already directed Oscar-winning films. In practice, it became a very good example of why Hollywood usually prefers to keep its biggest egos on separate sets. The relationship between Costner and Eastwood on the set was tense almost from the beginning. Both men had already directed Oscar-winning movies, which meant neither of them was especially interested in being told how to do his job. Costner naturally still tried. One day, after Kevin offered yet another piece of directing advice, the argument nearly turned into a fistfight. The two men had to be pulled apart, and Costner stormed off the set. Eastwood responded in the most Clint Eastwood way possible. He kept filming. Instead of shutting down production and waiting for his star to return, Eastwood simply brought in Costner's stand-in and continued shooting the movie without him. When Kevin came back at the end of the day and discovered that nobody had stopped working in his absence, he was furious. Eastwood let him complain. Then he calmly explained that he already had plenty of close-ups of Costner's face. If Kevin continued acting like an idiot, Eastwood could finish the movie without him. And if matching the footage became a problem, he could simply write a facial injury into the script and use the double for everything else. Costner stayed on the set after that. He also became much more selective about sharing his directing wisdom. A Perfect World was released in 1993 and is often described as the first real turning point in Costner's career. It earned only about $31 million domestically against a $30 million budget. International audiences saved it, pushing the worldwide total above $100 million. But the American performance came as a major surprise. Audiences generally liked the film. The awards voters apparently had other plans. Then came 1994. First, there was The War, a modest drama in which Costner appeared alongside a young Elijah Wood. It failed to make much of an impact. That alone would not have been disastrous. The real damage came from Wyatt Earp. Costner had originally been involved with another Earp project, Tombstone. After creative disagreements, he left and began developing his own version of the story. Hollywood suddenly had two Wyatt Earp movies racing toward theaters. The rival film nearly collapsed during production, and Costner reportedly used his influence to make its path to distribution even more difficult. Major studios were encouraged to stay away from Kurt Russell's movie. Despite all of that, Tombstone made it into theaters first and managed to recover its budget. Then Wyatt Earp arrived several months later. It cost $63 million and earned only $23 million. The cheaper, more troubled movie survived. Costner's expensive prestige Western collapsed. The damage was immediate. All the old jokes about Hollywood being able to film Kevin Costner reading the phone book and still make money suddenly disappeared. The Golden Raspberry Awards also arrived to make sure nobody missed the point. After a $63 million Western failed, a cautious star might have reduced the scale of his next project. Kevin Costner responded by making the most expensive movie in Hollywood history. That movie was Waterworld. The film's actual financial performance was more complicated than its reputation suggests. It earned substantial money internationally and later performed well on home video. But none of that mattered much at the time. The damage was already done. Wyatt Earp had shaken Costner's status. Waterworld turned him into a punchline. Then came The Postman. Released in 1997, it was another huge, expensive, deeply personal project built around Kevin Costner's belief that audiences still wanted exactly the kind of movie Kevin Costner wanted to make. They did not. Waterworld wounded his image. The Postman effectively killed the idea that Kevin Costner was still box office insurance. I covered both movies in detail in separate videos, but one detail makes the story especially painful. Instead of making The Postman, Costner could have starred in Air Force One. The project had been developed with him in mind, but he turned it down because he wanted to direct his own film. Harrison Ford took the role instead, and Air Force One became a major hit. Even after The Postman, Costner was offered another possible escape route. Michael Bay and the studio approached him about the lead role in Armageddon. Costner said no. Nobody seems to know exactly why. Maybe after The Postman, he looked at another giant science fiction movie and decided one apocalypse was enough for a while. Maybe he feared that another expensive failure would finish his career completely. Whatever the reason, Bruce Willis eventually took the role. Armageddon became one of the biggest hits of the year, so while Costner was trying to climb out of one of Hollywood's largest craters, Harrison Ford and Bruce Willis were taking two of the roles he rejected straight to the top of the box office. Costner still had enough momentum left to continue receiving expensive leading man offers. Some of those projects, including Message in a Bottle, had been arranged before the Postman fully revealed how much damage had been done. Then came 3,000 Miles to Graceland, one of the many suspiciously expensive productions associated with the notorious franchise pictures. There was also Dragonfly, another costly studio movie that spent years trapped in development because nobody wanted to pay Costner the salary he had negotiated back when he was still one of the biggest stars of the 1990s. Eventually, Universal picked up the project and paid him the full $15 million. The film cost around $60 million and earned only $52 million worldwide. His one genuine success during the 2000s came from the genre that had always mattered most to him, the Western. Costner returned to directing with Open Range. The movie cost approximately $22 million, the same budget as Dances with Wolves, and earned about $68 million worldwide. During the same period, movies such as 13 Days, The Upside of Anger, and Mr. Brooks received varying degrees of respect. Costner gradually moved away from traditional leading man roles. The Guardian, Rumor Has It, and The New Daughter all failed to generate much excitement. Then came Man of Steel, in which Costner played Jonathan Kent. The movie made plenty of money, although Warner Brothers still seemed disappointed that it had not made even more. Hollywood also tried to take advantage of the success of Taken by transforming Costner into another aging action hero. The experiment produced 3 Days to Kill and Criminal. Audiences remained unconvinced that what the action genre had been missing was Kevin Costner looking tired while holding a gun. Both movies failed to find much of an audience. He later appeared in supporting roles in successful films such as Hidden Figures and Molly's Game. Those projects helped keep him visible and reminded audiences that he was still a strong actor, but nobody could reasonably credit their box office performance to his name. The real comeback came from television. In 2012, Costner starred in the miniseries Hatfields and McCoys and won a Golden Globe. What might once have looked like a step down from movies instead became the beginning of his return. Then came Yellowstone. The series gave Costner one of the defining roles of his career. Then, after 5 enormously successful seasons, he left. Costner explained that he wanted to devote himself to a project he had been planning for years, a giant 4-part Western epic called Horizon: An American Saga. The first chapter of Horizon failed at the box office. The theatrical release of the second chapter was postponed, and the future of the entire planned saga became uncertain. Costner had already invested a significant amount of his own money. He had also begun work on the later installments, betting his property, his reputation, and possibly the final chapter of his career on the belief that audiences still wanted an enormous, old-fashioned Western epic. His best decisions and his worst decisions always came from exactly the same place. He was absolutely convinced that he knew what kind of movie needed to be made. Sometimes that belief produced 7 Academy Awards. Sometimes it produced The Postman. That was Frameback. Subscribe for more rewinds and see you on the next one.